Hey everybody, welcome back to the garage. If this is your first time visiting my channel, please go ahead, click on subscribe, and also click on the bell to receive all the updates on my channel as well as the sled. Also, check me out on Instagram. Okay, so this is part 2 of the IFS Extra 10 swap in this 1992 Polaris XCR 440, right? So we've already gone through the steps of mounting the rear skid. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go ahead and do the steps as far as swapping out all the components for the Extra 10 front, right? So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be replacing the tie rod, the the upper and lower radius arm, the shock and spring, the ski and the spindles. We're going to be reusing the trailing arm as well as the sway bar, right? So the donor sled was a 1997 Indy Trail 488 with the Extra 10 front and rear with a non-CRC front. So if there's any questions on what that means, go ahead, check out the video in the playlist. There will be an explanation of CRC, non-CRC, Extra 10, IFS, and everything else to give you a further explanation and clarification as far as what you're going to be looking at. Alright, so I went ahead and painted all the radius arms. I assure you they are there. I also painted the shock springs to match them up. More likely what we'll probably be doing is we'll probably be looking for a set of Fox shocks in the front just to kind of keep in tradition as far as what the XCR had originally. You know, the XCR does have Fox shocks. Right now these are just throwaway gas shocks, but you know, we're going to use them for mock-up. Make sure we don't run into any issues before we commit into anything other than what we have here. So what we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through the steps as far as what you need to do. This should be a pretty straightforward. All the components should come out fairly easy. There is maybe some access issues, but you know what? We'll work around them. All right, so that being said, let's get to work. Okay, so what we've done is we've jacked up the front of the sled. It's being supported by jack stands. And what we're going to do is we're going to take apart the essentially everything that's tied into the trailing arm. And everything on here is 9/16, with the exception of on the back side of these, these tie rod ends, there'll be a 1/2 inch flat that you can hold it. But for the most part, everything is 9/16. All right, so just finished up. It was actually a lot easier than I thought it was going to be. Probably the biggest challenge was removing some of the hardware on here. Essentially, the one issue I ran into was on the lower shock mount, and everything on there is just temporarily mounted. I just wanted to make sure everything was going to fit. But the biggest challenge was the lower shock, and the original shock, the bushing was actually seized to the bolt, so we actually had to cut that off. But what we ended up doing was I only need to use the shock, the upper and lower radius rod. We ended up reusing the existing tie rod and the end and the original sway bar. All of those are actually long enough to tie into the existing spindle. So what we'll do is I'm going to show you actually what I pulled off, but I'll show you how we pulled the lower radius rods off without having to remove the hardware that's attached to the bulkhead. So, you never know what you're going to find when you're working on an older machine, and this is what I pulled off. So on the left, those are the two lower radius rods. The ones on the right are the uppers, and have a shock that should have never been on there. If you look, it's significantly shorter. If we line that up, so evidently whoever had the sled before me hit something. It must have been in a real desperate situation to ride, because they they threw a shock in there from a unknown source, and they put a piece of aluminum in there, and then they put like a coupling block to tie it into the original shock mount. And yeah, what a disaster. So luckily it came right out. So but yeah, you never know what you're gonna find. So it's kind of a good thing that we decided to do this. So, but for the most part, it's a pretty straightforward thing to do. When you do it, and I'll show you once we actually crawl underneath it. But jack it up, put it up on jack stands so the everything is in full droop, and you have to do it on, as far as both sides in tandem, because you have to remove both shocks at the same time. Because if you don't, what will happen is, if you look at the sway bar, right? Yeah, remember the sway bar is tied into the trailing arm on both sides. So you have to remember, because essentially the sway bar acts as a lever between the trailing arms. You would think that each side is independent, but they're not. So you got to remember, because since the sway bar is tied into the trailing arm through the bulkhead and the other side, what happens is, because it's a lever, when this ski goes up, the trailing arm basically goes up with it, and also brings the ski on the opposite side up at the same time. So basically they're always in tandem and parallel with each other. So what will happen is, and this is important, what will happen is, if you try to remove one shock at a time, what's going to happen is the shock on the other side, because it's 2 inches shorter, will not allow the trailing arm to drop. And then if you go to try to put the shock in at the same time, because the trailing arm is still up, right, and that shock is 2.5 inches longer than the original one, you're never going to be able to get it in there. You're going to fight with it. So just do yourself a favor, remove both shocks at the same time, and then everything will be in full droop, and you'll go from there. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to just jack it up real quick. We'll put it up on jack stands. I'll show you what we did to make this real easy as far as changing the radius rods. Okay, so we're under the sled right now. And essentially what we're looking at right here, this is the front of the bulkhead. And on the other side of the bulkhead, there's some bolts that pass through the bulkhead. And then it goes through the heim joint, right, for the lower and upper radius rod. So there's two ways to do this. One way to do it is just to remove the nut off the bolt, but as you can see, the space is kind of tight down here. It's not the most easiest thing to get in at. Option one is to remove all the hardware and pass it through the bulkhead. Take the original lower and upper radius rods off. Put the new ones on, feed the bolt back through the bulkhead, and basically tighten everything up. The second option, which is what I did, is actually what I did is I just cracked the jam nut, and then I just unscrewed the radius rod from the existing heim joint and basically pulled the old one off, and then put the new one on, screwed it in, and it probably took all of 5 minutes to do both of them. It was very easy to do, and go from there. So doing that way is a lot easier than spending a half an hour or whatever it would be under the tight confines removing the bolt from the bulkhead. So doing it this way, it was probably done in 5 minutes. So, and this is assuming that you remove the hardware from the trailing arm. So doing it that way is pretty easy, because honestly, you have to make adjustments anyway, because you have to basically screw this in and out to set your camber on the trailing arm once you get everything mounted. So you're gonna be down here anyway, so it's just easier to do it that way. Okay, so as discussed, the swap is pretty straightforward. Other than a couple bolts that are kind of difficult to get at. One of which is that upper shock mount bolt. The space is pretty tight, and a couple seized bolts and bushings. The swap is pretty easy to do. So like I said, everything is mounted, but nothing is tightened down, and the reason being is now that I know everything fits in the original trailing arm, we're actually gonna take everything off, and I'm gonna basically prep the trailing arm and paint it, and reapply the graphics, and then we'll put everything on there permanently. So some may be asking, why did I decide to leave the stock trailing arm? And I kind of talked about this in the other video when we were doing the disassembly of the Indy Trail. And the main reason is that bolt has a tendency to get seized inside the footwell, and when you try to take it off, it snaps. And that's exactly what happened on one of the trailing arms on the Indy Trail. The bolt actually on this side actually broke. So I used the Indy Trail as a guinea pig, seeing how likely that was going to happen, and it did. So what I want to do is I want to make sure that the trailing arm would work, and indeed it does. So again, this trailing arm is really appropriate for the XCR as far as when it came out. Granted, we changed the shocks and the radius arms, but you know what? Unless somebody was actually really paying attention to it and saw that we had the longer shocks in it, on first guess, nobody would probably ever know that a change was made. So that's why we're keeping the trailing arm, for that reason, and more likely the bolt was going to snap anyway. So at this point, we're making pretty good progress on it. I feel good now that that's all done. Based on what happened on the chain case, feels like we're making some pretty good progress. So we're going to be taking everything apart, painting it, and start wrapping it up. If there's any questions, comments, concerns regarding the swap, go ahead and leave them in the comments box. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. As always, thanks for watching, and have a great day, and I'll talk to you later. See ya.